Having left the office, Bruce froze on the steps in front of the entrance and turned his face to the warm rays of the sun with a blissful smile on his face. At about that moment, the man realized that he was hungry, which meant that he needed to cross the street and get something to eat from a booth selling fresh pastries. Bruce loved all kinds of sweets since he was a little boy, especially his mother's apple pies and cinnamon muffins. Unfortunately, the businessman's mother died 5 years ago, and the woman he was living with now couldn't cook to save her life. Therefore, in order to enjoy his favorite treats, Bruce had to buy pastries from a booth located across the street from his house. The most surprising thing was that his love for pastries seemed to have no effect on his figure whatsoever. Somehow, the man managed to remain in great shape. That was partially due to the businessman's irregular schedule, which had him working 16-hour days. Bruce loved his job and never complained that it took too much time or effort. And now, trying not to waste precious time, the man quickly ran across the street and stopped at the pastry booth. The booth had an excellent assortment of treats, so much so that Bruce was having a hard time choosing what to get. At that moment, the man felt that someone was watching him. Bruce took a look around and immediately saw a girl of about 6. She was sitting at a bench and looking at him with hungry eyes. The girl's dress looked untidy. It was covered in dirt and dust, as if she'd been sitting on the ground a lot. Her shoes looked so old that they could fall apart at any moment. The sight of this little girl made Bruce's heart sink. The businessman didn't have his own children, and therefore he was extremely sensitive to the fact that some parents could neglect their duties so bluntly. The man didn't have to be a detective to figure out that the girl was hungry. It was simply too obvious. Bruce decided to get the girl a piece of cherry pie. He smiled at her and asked her to come over. "Here, this is for you. I'm not really a culinary expert, but the pastries here are delicious." The little girl didn't need a repeat invitation, and seconds later, she was already devouring the treat. "What's your name, honey? And where are your parents?" Bruce asked as softly as possible. The girl stopped chewing and looked at the man in the business suit standing in front of her. "My name is Sally, sir," the little girl said with undisguised respect in her voice. "And I'm Bruce Murphy, but you can just call me Bruce." The businessman introduced himself with a smile. The look in the girl's eyes made it clear that she felt very uncomfortable talking about her family, so Bruce decided to leave those questions for later. The businessman bought the girl a whole bag of pastries, a bottle of soda, and some sweets. "Here, take it. It's for you. Just don't binge on sweets or you'll ruin your appetite," Bruce said in parting. The man watched the girl leave and decided to go back to his office. For some reason, Bruce no longer felt like getting himself anything from the booth, which he was very excited about just a few moments earlier. The rest of the day went by in a bit of a haze, and it was only when he returned home that Bruce managed to cheer up slightly. But the very next morning, the feelings of sadness and anxiety came back and were even stronger than the day before, but the businessman had a very good reason for it. Having arrived at his office, the man sat down at the table and inadvertently plunged into memories of his past. Bruce Murphy was known among Chicago businessmen as extremely successful and competent. The man had a knack for doing business and a strong desire to succeed. Bruce Murphy grew up in an ordinary family. His mother worked as a cook in a school cafeteria, while his father worked as a bus driver. Since Bruce got good grades at school, he easily got into a university, where he was the best student in his year. The man easily understood everything that had anything to do with doing business and seemed like a fountain of new ideas and projects. By the time he turned 48 years old, he'd gained the reputation of a reliable person with whom one could do business without fearing of losing profits or getting scammed. Bruce didn't have a family, so he could devote all of his time to running the business. At that point in his life, Bruce was in a relationship with a woman who was also lonely and failed to find her soulmate for a long time. Unlike everyone else, Megan seemed very understanding of her partner and was never too pushy in her desire to get Bruce to marry her. Few people knew that 8 years ago, Bruce was in a relationship with a woman named Samantha, who left a deep wound in his heart. That relationship was due to fail due to their significant age difference. Samantha was 15 years younger than Bruce. having fallen head over heels for her. Like some schoolboy, the businessman was ready to bring the world to Samantha's feet. The prominent businessman immediately surrounded his young girlfriend with luxury, the kind she'd never had before in her life. Bruce took Samantha to expensive restaurants, gave her gifts, and did everything to ensure that their fairy tale lasted as long as possible. At the same time, the businessman tried not to see the condemning looks of his colleagues and acquaintances, who were sure that he was making a big mistake trying to connect his life with a younger woman. Love is often blind, and once a person falls for someone, it can be very hard for them to assess the situation adequately. Bruce sincerely believed that there was much more to his relationship with Samantha Lewis than just passion or mutual sympathy. Unfortunately, it later became clear that the businessman was wrong about it. Of course, their relationship was very romantic and emotional at first, which turned both of their heads. But when the fire of passion in the heart of the young woman faded away, things that used to be exciting and delightful only got a forced smile out of her. Their relationship kept going by inertia for a little while, but when Bruce went on a long business trip to New York, the situation changed in the most dramatic way. It just so happened that the businessman was away for about a month, and when he came back home, he immediately noticed a change in Samantha's behavior. First of all, the woman virtually stopped calling Bruce during his trip. Second of all, she was spending time with a young man who looked a lot better than his older competitor. Having learned about the young man in Samantha's life, Bruce chose not to make a scene and sort things out. Instead, he quietly stepped aside and let the young people live their life in peace. Bruce understood that an age difference of 15 years was probably too much for Samantha, and that the woman wanted to be with someone her own age rather than the aging businessman. Coming to terms with the bitter truth wasn't an easy thing to do. Sure, Bruce always kept it together in public, continuing to be the joyful man everyone was used to. But when the businessman was alone, his heart was literally breaking from the unbearable pain. Bruce couldn't think of anything better than trying to dull the pain with alcohol, seeking solace at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Meanwhile, Samantha was building her new relationship, hoping to soon see her boyfriend as her husband and head of the family. According to Bruce, his ex-girlfriend made the right choice, because the way he saw it, Michael Foster was the perfect man for her. Bruce never held a grudge and made sure to let Samantha know that whenever their paths crossed. First of all, the businessman was mad at himself because he was so busy working on his business that he completely dropped the ball on his personal life. Unfortunately, no matter how hard Bruce tried to move on with his life, the news of Samantha and Michael's upcoming wedding still caught him off guard. How is that fair? We dated for a year and she was never ready to take the next step. And they've only been dating for 3 months and she's ready to tie the knot? Bruce thought wistfully. It was only later that he realized the couple's reasons behind the rushed wedding. Bruce learned about it accidentally. He was going through his feed on one of the social media networks and came across a photo of Samantha holding a newborn baby boy and a girl in her arms. Twins! That's so wonderful. Bruce was genuinely happy. The businessman always wanted to have children, but he never really got the chance. The main obstacle was the heavy workload, which prevented him from ever starting a family where a kiddo could be surrounded by love and care. It was only after Samantha got married and had twins that Bruce realized that there was definitely no connection between them anymore. For the longest time, the man had hoped that they would eventually get back together, but now he realized that they were definitely done. Moreover, the businessman knew that it would be hard for him to compete with Michael, who was younger and more attractive than Bruce. Thus, the businessman went back to his bachelor life, which he'd long been accustomed to. Of course, he couldn't just stop loving his ex-girlfriend, and therefore he tried not to let himself take trips down memory lane, so as not to torture himself. But then something happened that literally turned everything upside down. Samantha and Michael died in a plane crash. Bruce heard the news on TV when the anchor shared the victims' names. The terrible news shook the businessman to the very core. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he still believed that Samantha would come back to him one day and everything would be the same as before. But now, all those thoughts and hopes had become meaningless. Bruce didn't attend the funeral because it was simply unbearable for him to see the closed coffin with the body of his ex-girlfriend. At that moment, the businessman was ready to forgive Samantha for everything that happened between them. Despite the fact that 7 years had passed since the death of his beloved woman, Bruce remembered every single detail of the wonderful time when he was happy and loved. Of course, Bruce didn't exactly turn into a hermit, and 2 years ago, he met Megan and even started a kind of relationship with her. Unfortunately, they were too old to have kiddos on their own, and Bruce understood it like no one else. Nevertheless, Megan turned out to be a rather complacent woman and was actually the first to offer her boyfriend to adopt a child. Bruce agreed at first, but then he decided to postpone such an important step due to his heavy workload. Days passed, but then the man continued to live in the past, thinking about Samantha all the time. Of course, like any smart woman, Megan felt that something was off, but she'd never started any scenes and accepted Bruce just the way he was. The woman probably had sincere feelings for Bruce, whom she saw as an example of a perfect man. Bruce got pulled out of his sad thoughts by the sound of his phone. Despite the fact that the businessman could never forget the date of Samantha's death, he still set himself a reminder for such an important date. On the anniversary of Samantha's death, Bruce usually went to the cemetery to visit her grave. The businessman always brought flowers, which he placed in a granite vase next to the gravestone. Bruce didn't forget about Michael either, who was never really his enemy. Samantha was the one to make the choice, and therefore, it would be wrong to blame the deceased couple for anything. Having given some instructions to his deputy, Bruce left the office and went to the parking lot to get his car. The cemetery was about 1.5 miles away, which was nothing for Bruce's new Ford with its new powerful engine. During the years, the cemetery caretaker got used to seeing Bruce and always greeted him like an old acquaintance. That day, he also waved at Bruce before going to his lodge. The caretaker knew that the businessman had been taking care of the young people's grave for several years and believed that he must have been their friend or a relative. Since being at the cemetery was always very emotional for Bruce, he walked down the paths with an impenetrable expression on his face. However, when he was only 100 yards away from Samantha's grave, the man saw 2 kids standing at the very gravestone. Who are they? Maybe some homeless kiddos or something, Bruce thought sadly. But when the businessman came closer, he saw something that made him feel very uncomfortable. A little boy and a little girl of about the same age were standing by the graves of Michael and Samantha. They were looking at the tombstones with tears in their eyes. But that wasn't even the surprising part. The most unexpected was the fact that Bruce recognized the little girl. It was the same kiddo he bought the treats for the day before. "Sally? What are you doing here?" Bruce asked cautiously. The girl immediately recognized him and smiled affably. Bruce didn't know the name of the girl's companion, but for some reason he was sure that he was her brother. And then Sally said something that made Bruce's heart nearly jump out of his chest. "These are our parents. Bobby and I were only 2 years old when they died. My brother and I stayed with the nanny that day. She said that it saved our lives." The girl explained. She spoke quietly and sounded very adult. What he heard the girl say made Bruce feel dizzy. The man was very shaken up by Sally's confession. His mind simply refused to comprehend how such coincidences could happen in life. Unable to contain his emotions, Bruce hugged little Bobby and Sally, after which he teared up and kissed the kiddos on the cheeks. He didn't think of them as some homeless orphans anymore. Despite the fact that he wasn't their biological father, Bruce couldn't help but feel that they were related. The man's head got filled with all kinds of thoughts. Then he remembered Megan's idea about adopting a child. But why would we want to adopt someone we don't know if we could get custody of these wonderful kiddos? Bruce thought with tears in his eyes. As it turned out, Bobby and Sally still lived with the same nanny who was taking care of them at the time of their parents' death. By this time, Charlotte Morgan's health had deteriorated so much that she could no longer take care of the children, and they were virtually left to their own devices. Bruce didn't hide the fact that he used to know the kiddo's mother. The man felt in his heart that Bobby and Sally had inherited the best features of their late mother. That day, Bobby and Sally spent the night at Bruce's home. Megan's joy knew no bounds. The woman didn't even dare to dream about having 2 kiddos and not just 1. Of course, Bruce told Charlotte Morgan that he intended to get custody of late Samantha's kiddos and raise them as his own. The news made the woman tear up. All this time, the elderly nanny was terrified to think that she could die before she could raise the kiddos. Realizing that Bobby and Sally were very attached to their nanny, Bruce decided to ask Mrs. Morgan to move in with them too. It definitely wouldn't hurt anyone, but it would let this tired woman get some rest and recover, Bruce thought. It took about a month to get all the documents in order. During this time, Charlotte Morgan got treatment at the best hospital in the city, which improved her health significantly. Now, Bobby and Sally lived with Bruce and couldn't be happier to have found such a great adoptive father. Moreover, Bruce decided that it was time to make things official with Megan, which made her the happiest woman on earth, since she would now be a mother of 2 amazing children. To honor the memory of his late girlfriend, Bruce continued to visit her grave and put flowers in a vase by the gravestone. Only now, the businessman didn't come alone, but together with Bobby and Sally, who also wanted to honor the memory of their late parents, whose life ended so early.